Hey everyone, it's Ed Gutowski. I wanted to create a short video that talks about the next step of understanding how rhetoric and argument works. I've read all your discussion board questions. They've been fantastic. I loved how students have defined and examined the issues of rhetoric and argument. So now we're going to talk about the next phase of understanding how rhetoric and argument works. So for this lecture, you may want to use your textbook and look over chapter 4, as it might help you to understand some of the terms I'm going to give in this lecture. But I'm now going to add to our understanding of how rhetoric and argument works, because rhetoric and argument use three things. Rhetoric and argument always uses logos, pathos, and ethos. So I've loved the discussion board questions, and I've noticed that many students have defined rhetoric as the ability to persuade. I'm still going to maintain my definition of rhetoric as words used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. But now we're going to add to our understanding of rhetoric and argument by understanding how they use logos, pathos, and ethos. So in a ground class, what I would do is I'd write down these three terms on the board and ask students to basically define the terms based on how they look. So for this lecture, you would probably base them on how you hear them. But if we look at the word logos, or we hear the word logos, most students can define and kind of guess what logos is, because logos is an appeal to logic. So it would make sense that if you were going to use rhetoric to persuade someone, that you'd want to make a logical appeal. Sometimes students guess things like facts and statistics, and notice those are other ways that we can tie into logic as a way to use rhetoric to persuade. So pathos is the second term, and I always try to remember that the P in pathos might stand for passion, because pathos is an appeal to emotion. And if you accept my definition of rhetoric as words used to mislead, deceive, and con people, then it would make sense that you might want to make an emotional appeal. You might want to use pathos because we're all emotional beings. The last term is ethos, and I'll define ethos as two ways. Ethos is an appeal to ethics and morality, but it can also be an appeal to character and authority. In our class, I will define ethos as character and authority rather than defining it as morals and ethics, because if we have enough time, we'll get into stasis theory, which looks at the moral issues. So ethos being an appeal to character and authority. So I sometimes use an example, because that's the one that confuses students the most, but I look at ethos as, if you could have this class being taught by a professor at Harvard or by me, who would you pick? And the idea is that someone who teaches at Harvard has great ethos. They have great character because they're teaching at one of the greatest universities in the nation. So I always think of ethos as appeal to character and authority. So what I'm going to have you do in the discussion board question is just examine these three terms and pick the one that you think is the most important. And I'll look forward to seeing what you have to say.